There we go.
Hey, we're live.
All right, you're first.
Oh, I go first? Okay.
You can't sit. You need to stand here so that it's nicely framed.
Oh, okay. All right.
We're recording so that people online can watch as well.
By being here, you provide your consent to being recorded either audioly or visually.
Probably just audioly because
Probably
it's facing
just
toward you.
Unless you want to come up and stand here.
Say a special hi to Marcia because she's watching.
Oh, hi, Marcia. This is a special hello. Thank you for watching. Thank you for everybody else who may be watching either live or at some other point in the future. This is the first of a series of 3 forums that we're going to have to kind of get a closer look at the Nicene Creed in terms of not necessarily just in terms of what it means for us as a worshiping community, but what it means as part of the world. One of the things that we know but we don't often think about is that the church is always part of a context in the world, and so the creed has its context in the world, both in the past and in the present. It will in the future. So today we are looking at the past of the creed. And so this one is called Power, because we're going to end up talking quite a bit later about power. First, I am going to get us started with some of the, perhaps I'm going to lead us up to Nicaea and say, there are lots of churches nowadays that don't have creeds at all, or say, I know that one denomination says the Bible is our creed because the Bible contains knowledge of God revealed in Jesus. So I don't want to take it for granted that anybody here or anybody who might be watching online knows what a creed is or what a creed does. And so the word creed is based on the Latin word credo, which means I believe, but is not necessarily limited to the modern idea of belief. Like when we say I believe, oftentimes we believe an idea, or we believe what a person is saying is correct. And in this case, the older form of credo, I believe, can be interpreted as I trust. You wouldn't believe an idea so much as you believe a person. You place your trust in them. One of the theologians that I grew up with, Marcus Borg, would say that it is closer to I beloved, because it is a way that I give my heart to. I place all of my trust in. And so the first Christian creeds appear in the Bible, and they're a response to the question that Jesus asks in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. Who do you say that I am? It can be said that the first creeds are not about what ideas we compile about Jesus, but how do we make sense of this person? And so Peter says, you are the Messiah, which is actually a creed. One that Paul uses in more than one place is Jesus is Lord. And one that the book of Acts has is Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And those are just very small statements, a way of trying to reconcile who this person is, especially for people who were almost all Jewish, already had a concept of God, trying to figure out how Jesus fit into that, to their former experience of God before Jesus. Now trying to figure out, how does Jesus fit into all this stuff that I already know, that I already believe? And so from those earliest creeds, we start to see some form of expansion. Jesus is Lord is something that we can all agree upon as a statement in itself. But once you are done saying that phrase, it starts to get a little thornier. How is Jesus Lord? In what way is Jesus Lord? What makes Jesus Lord? My point is that there are many different directions that you can go in with these earliest creeds, these earliest ideas. And we start to see a little bit of that in the Bible. In Philippians, Paul talks about Jesus emptying himself, taking the form of a slave. That is all part of a creedal statement, trying to explain how Jesus is Lord. And so we work through this in the Bible. It spills outside of the Bible's timeline into the experience of people, Jews, Greeks, Romans. I realize this is kind of the boring part, but you need it for the next good part. We are usually led to believe that this is the most precise way to refer to the story of Christian faith, that there is one faith that is handed down and it continues unimpeded with offshoots that are combated, sometimes reconciled, sometimes not. But the idea of one kind of orthodoxy, one central idea, runs up against the idea that we have to ask these questions about how is Jesus Lord. Maybe you want to consider that the furthest left point there is that phrase, Jesus is Lord, or something like it. But what we think of in the book of Acts as there being one form of the faith that is handed down is something that is written in after the fact to hearten later believers, to encourage them in their belief. Because I think a better form of this image is probably this, which is to say, by the time we get to Paul, just 20 years after Jesus, Paul is writing to a number of different communities who have very different ideas about who Jesus is, about whether Jesus came in the flesh, about what the experience of Jesus means for being Jewish, whether or not I have to be Jewish to believe in Jesus. There are many, many ideas that are all percolating at the same time. And so instead of this one common thread, perhaps you can find that thread in retrospect, but we can't treat it as one thing. Do you have it or do you fall away from it? Because one of the beautiful things about Christianity, as we know today, is also one of the dangerous things, which is its Christianity's ability to meet us in our context, our experience. One of the reasons why Christianity has been so compelling to people all around the world is that people who are nothing like us can hear the good news that Jesus is Lord, but they live it out in different ways than we do, just by virtue of the fact that they are different than who we are. And so their perspectives will be different. We don't call variations in Christian faith nowadays heresies, but go back to, you're chuckling because Martin Luther would have no problem calling things like John Calvin's Reformed Church. He would call that a heresy. He would call the Catholic Church itself a heretical group. And so we don't talk about it that way nowadays because we understand the importance of context. Paul already, barely a generation after Jesus, is writing to people in wildly different contexts. And so everybody is asking this question about what it means to be Christian, what it means to follow Jesus, and we're not always coming up with the same answers. Is that a good introduction for
Sounds
for
good.
the story of the Emperor. I didn't bring my Darth Vader helmet. I should have. I will next time.
He doesn't actually have a Darth Vader helmet.
I can get one.
Maybe Lucas can print one for you.
Oh, thank you.
So as Bob explains to us, the earliest people who professed Christ were experiencing him, right? They were his followers. They were the people who maybe even experienced him in a different kind of way, like Paul, who met Jesus on the road, but he had already ascended, and so in this kind of mystical way, we have this experience. Bless you. But as more people are trying to understand this, we go from that understanding of, my experience of Jesus as Lord is through my experience of Jesus. But then we start to develop institutions, right? we start to develop trying to work together to figure out how we can agree. And that's not experience, that's doctrine. And as Christianity spreads, it becomes more and more important to have these conversations because of this, because we want to make sure, of course, that the people that we know who also are interested in this Christianity thing agree with me and not you, right? Because we want to make sure that they're on my team, that they get it right. This is all very important stuff, like Paul is talking about life and death and meaning and who is this Jesus and what has he changed and how is this going to work moving forward? These are big questions, and there are questions, as we learned today in our sermon, they are questions that must be asked together. But as soon as you have two people in a room, it's no longer your personal experience of Jesus, it's now doctrine. It's now a conversation about what does this mean and how do we share understanding of this. So wanted to share this with you because we're going to now leap forward from the earliest church and move toward the year 300 and talk a little bit about the context of the Nicene Creed. So in the year 50, which was about 20 years past Jesus-ish, so this is when Paul is still active at this time. There are less than 1,000 people, fewer than 1,000 people who would profess Christianity. Most of them are in Palestine. Many of them are Jewish, but as Paul goes out on his missions, more and more of them are Gentiles. The interesting thing to me is, we have this sense, I think, in our I think we've been together long enough that I can use this word and you'll all understand what I do and don't mean by it. In our mythology of the history of Christianity, in the stories that we tell each other to make meaning of our history. So I'm not saying mythology as a negative thing. I'm just saying it as, these are the stories we tell each other. In our mythology of Christianity, early Christians were persecuted all the time, right? They got thrown to the lions, they were given to the gladiators, all these types of things. But it wasn't really like that. It was mostly for the first 250 years, for the most part, it was regional, local types of things. Issues would come up. A local governor would be upset because they discovered that the Christians weren't worshiping the emperor properly, if that was the thing, or they weren't worshiping the gods that they wanted them to worship, things like that. And so there would be some localized persecutions, but there wasn't a whole lot of global persecution for the most part. It depended on who was emperor at the time and all those types of things. We are talking about significant amounts of time here, 250 years. But you can see, interestingly, how really relatively quickly this grew. There's no internet, there's no TikTok to put your 30-second video up and tell everybody what it is you believe about this guy and get them to get on board. Within that first 50 years, past the kind of initial phase, we've grown by 6,000 people. And then in another 100 years, we're up to 200,000 people. At year 250, we're over 1 million people. So just think about that, and think about our chart with all the different beliefs and all the different experiences that people have had and what they bring to their understanding of Jesus as Lord, and how different people are going to interpret that and interpret what it means and how it works for their lives.
So what does 1.9% mean there?
So that those two last ones have, I just put on there the estimated percentage of the full population of the Roman Empire.
Of the empire.
So that's interesting, right? So within 200 years, this Jesus movement, this Jesus is Lord thing, has grown so that 2% of the entire population of the Roman Empire confesses Christianity. And then by the year 300, it's up to 10%. That's huge. I forget what the statistic is, but I think, is it 5%? If 5% of the population rises up to change something, then that kind of is the tipping point, and the powers that be have to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I know there's
something
something in there that, at any given time in history, if a certain it's very small, it's 3.5 or 5 or something like that. So 10% of the population being Christian is actually a really big deal. And
at the risk of asking a question that you're going to answer later, what does that do for an empire that depends on its temples and its Roman gods? Oh, okay.
Not yet.
not yet.
Not yet.
3.5%.
3.5. So only 3.5% of the population has the power to change, like make big changes, major changes. And we're looking at, by the year 300, 10%. Now, I think what's hard for us to understand contextually, because Christianity has been part of the culture of the Western world for so many centuries. So what's hard for us to understand is how different this Jesus thing would have been for people to experience. It's the reversal of power that is really challenging for people who have power. The idea that God, the power of God, is manifested not in the power of Jesus, but in the chosen weakness of Jesus. By giving up his power, that is where he gets power. And this is a challenge to the structure of society, the structure of the universe, right? God has chosen to come into the world not as a king or an emperor, but as a nobody who chooses to have no home, who wanders around with his nobody buddies and serve other people. And so this is really difficult for people who are in power to accept. And as more and more people kind of get interested in this and start to take this in, which makes sense, right? If you're just an average person and you're learning that God works through people like me, God is on my side, that makes a lot of sense for them to buy into that. But the people who have the power don't like this, right? Because for them, they want, they want to maintain their concepts of how hierarchies work, how power works, because they have a vested interest in that, right? They want to keep their power. And so the idea that a powerless man can create a whole new way of living is a threat to that power. And so it makes sense that whenever somebody would hear about these Christians and run into them in a meaningful way, their initial response would be to squash it, get rid of these people, because they were revolutionary, and they were revolutionary in a way that undermines the structure. Christianity historically was also a threat and a challenge, because in the Roman Empire, there was a lot of diversity. In a second, I'm going to show you a map of how big this thing is. And for many types of social organization, whether it's religious or, schools of thought, or even just, physical communities, there was a lot of hierarchy. There was a lot of division. Christianity, as we see in our Bible today, wipes away as much of that as possible. There is no Jew or Greek. There is no slave or free. There is no male or female. The idea that there's a place for you, if you're a man or a woman, if you're rich or poor, if you, if you are a slave, if you are a freed slave, if you're a person who's never been a slave, if you're rich, if you, are looking for meaning, but you can't find it in money, if you have no money and you're looking for, a place to belong, everyone is welcome into that. And this idea that, you don't have to pay to be part of it. You don't have to do anything really. You just show up and you start participating in the life of the church. And this is a good reason for, Christianity to spread and be so successful, but it's also a good reason for it to be threatening to the powers that be. Next thing I'm going to talk to you about, yes, we'll move on. So in American education, we don't learn very much about this time period. I think if you took any classes in the Roman Empire, it kind of probably went up through, Julius Caesar and maybe cut off from there. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of background. So in the 3rd century of the Roman Empire, which is the 200s, there was a ton of upheaval. There were different emperors fighting with each other. Different areas of the empire were breaking up and coming back together, and it was just a mess. There were times when it was literally a crisis, that the Roman Empire was just going to collapse and there would be no more Roman Empire. And so in 284, the Emperor Diocletian took power, and he decided that he was going to try to bring some stability to the empire. So you can see here in this little map, this is the entire Mediterranean basin.
Can I say something real quick?
Yes.
I believe the correct number is, in the 50 years before Diocletian became emperor, in the 50 years, the Roman Empire had 30 emperors.
Yes, that's
I believe
correct.
That's the number.
And they were all like overlapping each other. Different people were claiming to be emperor at the same time, and different other people were like legitimizing that person as emperor. So it was just a mess. It was a huge political mess. And so Diocletian decides that he's got enough power to kind of really fix this and pick it up again. But this is what he's looking at in terms of the land mass that he's got to control. It's huge. It goes all the way from Britain to Egypt. Huge. And think about not just the space, but think about the geographical diversity, think about the cultural diversity, think about the economic diversity of these areas that he's got to deal with. And so what Diocletian decided to do was he decided to actually divide his empire up into 4 pieces. And this is called the Tetrarchy. He took one piece of the empire that he was going to focus his attention on, and he appointed a co-emperor who was going to lead another piece of it with him. And then he also appointed 2 others who were kind of mini emperors, secondary emperors, and they each got a section as well. And so there are 4 sections that are geographical regions so that they can focus a little bit more on their particular area, their particular types of culture, the needs of those types of people, and the way that you maintain power in those types of areas. And this actually worked a little bit. Diocletian wanted to be known as a renewer of the traditional Roman glory. He's looking back to the time before this crisis that we're talking about in the 50 years at the end of the 3rd century. He wants to return us to the golden age of Rome. Does any of this sound familiar? And so he does this, and he realizes that even within these regions, there's going to be enough diversity of opinion, enough diversity of experience, enough diversity of economic sources of, how people get their money and all these different things, that he's still going to have some problems. And so he decides that he is going to also have a religious revival. He wants to bring back, he believes that a lot of the problems of the past 50 to 100 years are caused by people kind of losing sight of the traditional Roman gods. And so he wants to revive Roman religion as well, understanding that if other shared cultural markers are missing, like ethnicity and economics and geography, religion is something that can bring people together. And so he starts this process. You probably can't see it up there, and this is not the point. There are so many names, and I don't want to bring too many of them into the conversation, but Galerius is his co-emperor. And Galerius is really important because Galerius is not only one of the co-emperor, but he is we don't really know, he's either incredibly pious and really, really wants to push this Roman religion thing, or he's incredibly manipulative and uses Diocletian's own piety to manipulate him into doing what he wants so that he can gain power. And so Galerius is actually the one who comes to Diocletian and says, hey, we're trying to bring the empire together. We're trying to create peace and stability. We're trying to return to the golden age of Rome and have everybody on the same page in terms of the Roman gods. Did you know that there is this group of people who is not doing it? They don't want to participate. And Diocletian was trying to hold on to some of the historical tolerance of the Roman Empire. Historically, they actually were pretty tolerant of different religions and different choice, like personal choice in terms of your religious convictions and things like that. So he kind of pushed against this for a while, but several unfortunate events all kind of coincided that ended up not in a kind of a bad situation for the Christians. So in the winter of the year 302, so this is right around the year 300, Galerius and Diocletian were hanging out at the imperial palace in Nicomedia, which is right here. So this is
just outside what is Constantinople.
Yes. So that was where the imperial palace, the center of power, was for Diocletian's part of the empire. We talk about the Roman Empire, but the center of power was not actually always in Rome itself. It was all over the place. And at this point, it was in Nicomedia for Diocletian's district. And they were hanging out in the wintertime. And Galerius was trying to get Diocletian to go after these Christians. He was trying to argue about this with him. And they're going back and forth about this. And so Diocletian decided that he was going to send an emissary to the oracle at Didyma for guidance. And the oracle sent back a response that, I don't know if you believe this or not, but it was a little vague. Didn't really mean a whole lot. So they didn't really know what to do with that. But something that happened is, while they were waiting for the oracle to return, there was a big fire in the imperial palace. And just a few months, maybe a few years at the start, but just recently, the Christians in Nicomedia had built a beautiful church up on the top of a hill, and it overlooked the imperial palace. And now the imperial palace catches on fire, right in the middle of this argument that these two co-emperors are trying to have. And so Galerius convinces Diocletian that the reason why the imperial palace burned was because of the Christians. Whether they themselves set the fire or whether the gods set the fire, he convinced Diocletian that it was the Christians that were to blame for this. Now, it makes sense that in Nicomedia, Galerius would be even more concerned about these Christians, because the fact that they built this nice church doesn't just mean that their numbers are growing. It also means that their influence is growing as well, right? That they've now got enough money and power to acquire land and build this beautiful church. And so they are becoming more and more of a presence in the empire. And so the response that comes back from the oracle, yes.
Question of curiosity. You'd mentioned the growing presence of Christians. I'm guessing the majority of Christians in that empire were in this area of Nicomedia, like more, I think, of Paul's journeys. Like there were probably more Christians in the Roman Empire in this part of the world.
Yes, correct. So we've got, at this point, we've got our 10% of Christians, but it's not evenly dispersed across that whole circle of the map. It's gonna be more heavily in those areas. You can even see, some of the names that we're familiar with from our Bible. We've got Ephesus, we've got Antioch, we've got Thessalonica. Those are the places that are on that side where Diocletian is and where Nicomedia is located. And so, yes, so it's unlikely that you would see much in the way of Christian presence, and especially churches and things in what we now know as France or Northern Africa, but you would definitely see a lot more because that happens to be where it started, right? Yes. So all of these circumstances coalesce, and Galerius is successful in convincing Diocletian to start this general persecution. So this begins a time of pretty tough circumstances for a lot of these Christians. The first thing that they did was they razed the church that had just been built. They got rid of it, threw it out. They arrested a lot of people. The first thing that they tried to do was find the person responsible for the fire. Historically, we're pretty sure it was Galerius, but we don't have proof of that. But they're running out trying to find this person or people, and because Galerius had convinced Diocletian that it was the Christians who had conspired with some of the palace eunuchs to set this fire, it was actually their fault. So lots of people were arrested, people were killed. And then, like I said, the church was razed, scriptures were burned, any treasures that the church had were seized. And then on the 23rd of February in 302, on the feast of Terminalia, for the god Terminus, the god of boundaries, they decided that they were going to terminate the Christians. How poetic. And so there was an edict against the Christians that was published the very next day. And so things are pretty tough for the Christians for a while. It was much worse on that eastern side of the map than in other places. But it's actually interesting because the generic population does not seem to have bought into the persecution very much. This sense that that when the emperor speaks and says, this is how we're going to do this, everybody just kind of falls in line. And if you don't fall in line, then your neighbors are going to turn you in and, all those types of things. That didn't really happen as much in this period. But the people who did suffer were then turned into martyrs and given those stories that we now hear today that help us to, bolster our own faith when we have times of suffering and struggle. And so this all started, like I said, in 302, and in less than 10 years later, so Diocletian actually abdicated his throne. He is, I think, the only Roman emperor to ever peacefully leave office and live the rest of his life without being murdered.
That was part of his plan with the empire split into 4 pieces. There were 2 upper management emperors and 2 lower management emperors. And the idea was that an emperor would retire and would already have a successor who could take his place and could then select another successor.
Who was already powerful, so there wouldn't be the instability of the transition.
Yeah, and so there would be peaceful transitions. So he kicked it off.
Yes. So Diocletian retired from being the emperor. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute. But later, when Galerius was dying in 311, so this is less than 10 years later, Galerius himself on his deathbed admitted that the persecutions of the Christians did not work, and he rescinded the edict that had been put out against Christians and said, we're going to end these persecutions, and Christianity is now legal again. So he himself said they worked as hard as they could, they persecuted these people as much as they possibly could, and still it did not tamp down this movement. Because remember, at this point, we've got 6 million Christians, and certain communities were heavily persecuted. Lots of people died, lots of people suffered, lots of people lost their property, but it just wasn't enough, especially because they were able to use this martyrdom idea and use persecution for their own benefit. It was brilliant. Goodbye, Castillos.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'm a mistake. So you're recording it.
Yes, we are recording it. All right. So that's where we are with this whole persecution thing. Now, I want to go back to the map because there is an important guy here that I have not mentioned yet. His name is Constantius, and he is the lower management emperor of the yellow part. So he's got Britain and France, and kind of what we currently call them. And he's got a son, and his son's name is Constantine. But when Diocletian retires and Constantius gets elevated up, the next person put into that kind of second tier is not Constantine. They pick somebody else. And Constantine is super angry about this. Because of course he is, right? It's his father was the guy that, got to move up, and now it should be his turn to move into that place. And so we've got this little guy, Constantine, that's kind of hanging around the periphery, being angry at Diocletian and his whole decision-making process. So we have to keep that in mind. So our persecutions are over, and now we've got this guy, Constantine. Now, we need to pause for a minute because we as Christians and we as scholars of the West have learned a lot of things about Constantine, probably more or less, in school, and we kind of hear things about him occasionally, at least I do, in the different things that I read. So we have to remember that history is told by the victor. And so sometimes we have to look back and we have to look at the evidence around writings to see if those writings are truly just historical records of what happened, or if they are interpretations of those events for the purpose of propaganda, maybe. So we think we know what the situation is with Constantine and, the first Christian emperor and all of this, but there's a lot that's been going on even recently in terms of discoveries of new writings and new information, different, modes of scientific inquiry that actually provide us with potentially a clearer picture of what's going on with this guy. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more than we are going to talk about again, what I will call the mythology of Constantine. Again, mythology not being a bad thing, just being the stories that we tell each other that give meaning. When we're looking at events to give them meaning, which is what humans do, oftentimes we'll emphasize certain points, we'll de-emphasize certain points so that we can support the meaning that we're trying to make, right? So let's talk about Constantine.
Before we move into Constantine, are there any questions about
Yes,
all the
this is a lot.
history
There's a lot going
that
on.
we had to get through to get to Constantine?
So did I understand from what you shared that Constantine was the junior guy in the French English area, didn't get promoted, got angry, and eventually was reassigned over into Turkey?
No. So Constantine's father, who has a very similar name, so it's very confusing. Constantine's father was the junior emperor in France and England.
Okay.
And then when he was promoted into being a senior emperor, it should have been his son that was brought in as the junior emperor, but they didn't give him the job. They gave it to somebody else. And so both father and son are kind of mad about this because they thought it was going to be him and it was someone else. So it's just a little tidbit that's going to be important as we move forward.
Each upper emperor nominated the other's lower emperor, supposed to be a way to avoid these sorts of squabbles, and in fact just created
more squabbles. So Constantine was, as I said, the son of this junior emperor. And so he was, being groomed to eventually become a junior emperor in his own right, and then someday a senior emperor. But that's not how it worked out because he was not assigned. Constantine was also a person who was taught from an early age that that religion is something that is very powerful. The gods are not to be trifled with, but that you can make allegiances perhaps with them. And he chose to associate himself with gods of the sun. Apollo is one of the gods of the sun. Sol Invictus is one of the gods that he really connected with. But living in this cultural space where personal choice in terms of religion and the liberal welcome that the Roman Empire, generally speaking, took on, as they conquered new people meant that they were constantly getting new gods and new iterations of gods and new understandings of gods. And so each person, each community could have its own set of gods, its own set of values, its own set of foci in terms of, you know, what it is that was important to them. And as we already talked about, that's destabilizing to an empire, right? To have different communities, different pockets of people having different values, different ways of understanding how the world works. That isn't sustainable to keep the empire together. But Constantine grew up in this, and so he had, just like everybody else from his society, he had his god that he had connected to, and he was kind of he had kind of formed an alliance with, so to speak, and the idea was that, you know, he would make sacrifices to his god, and his god would hopefully, you know, respond by supporting him and giving him success in whatever it was that he did. So Constantine is at this point battling. He wants his rightful position, right? And so Diocletian had this great idea with the tetrarchy and the 4 different guys and creating stability and everything. It worked with the first group of 4 people. It worked pretty well, but as soon as he left, the whole thing kind of fell apart. And it turned into, once again, there were civil wars. There were people fighting over who was going to be next and who was going to take over and all of this stuff. And Constantine was just completely embroiled in all of this because he thinks that, you know, he has a rightful place in this hierarchy of emperors because his father was involved. So Constantine is at war, and here is kind of the moment, the crux of the matter in terms of his relationship to Christianity. So the story goes that Constantine was on the battlefield, and suddenly the sky split open and this sign appeared. And the sign is described as thus: a heavenly sign of God, to be marked on the shields of his soldiers. It was a letter X turned sideways with the top of its head bent around. Does anybody know what that is? So it's a letter X turned sideways. So that's like a cross, right? And then the top of its head turned around.
Oh, I know.
A rho, yes. So Chi Rho is now what we understand to be one of the symbols of Jesus. So supposedly all of his soldiers saw this sign in the sky. And then later he had a similar dream, in which he was told to mark this sign on his soldiers' shields, and by this you shall conquer, it said. And so it is understood by historians interpreting this event just after the life of Constantine that this was the moment of Constantine's conversion to Christianity. Jesus, or a sign of Jesus, appears to him and tells him that you are no longer to be allied with the gods of the sun. You are to be allied with the SON, Son of God. And it helps that they did put this sign on the shields and they did win the battle. But why Constantine did this is what is up for debate. Is it because he genuinely had some kind of conversion experience and encountered, Jesus of Nazareth and understood what it means to be a follower of the powerless servant who uses his servanthood to bring justice and goodness into the world? Or does he see an opportunity here? He sees that Christianity is popular with the people. He sees that it is a place where everyone fits, not just certain people, depending on, your interests or your region, or your gender or your economic status. It works for everyone. He sees that that it is something that can potentially be used to bring stability. And it doesn't hurt that Diocletian, the guy who caused him to be in this battle in the first place by not giving him his job that he was supposed to get, had been persecuting the Christians. And so maybe I should do the opposite of this guy, not just because it's going to help me, but also maybe because it, is going to stick a thumb in the eye of this person that I don't really like very much. It kind of is a reversal of what he's got going on. So Constantine decides, and we are never going to know why. The history books tell us it's because he became a devout Christian, but I think when we look at the evidence of what he actually did in his lifetime, I think it's something else. I think it's political. I think it's motivated by his desire to consolidate power and seeing that Christianity could be a really good tool for that purpose. And so he finally takes control, and he becomes by the year 313. So this is just the very next year. He is now one of the co-emperor. He's the big cheese in that relationship. And so in 313, he announced that it is proper that the Christians and all others should have liberty to follow that mode of religion which to each of them appeared best. And so he granted tolerance to all religions, including Christianity. And then, and this was called the Edict of Milan. It also returned confiscated church property that had been taken under Diocletian, and made the empire, it was officially neutral in regard to religion. So anyone could worship in whatever way they wanted. But even though it was kind of an equaling of fields for religions, Christianity kind of came out on top because the idea of religious worship as helpful to the stability of the empire was emphasized. And so people were kind of encouraged toward Christianity, but not forced. So again, there's evidence that can kind of, put us in either direction here. Most of the people that Constantine surrounded himself with, his advisors, his military officers, things like that, were not Christians throughout his rule. So is that because he genuinely believed that it should be, about the heart of the person and their personal convictions, and they should be able to choose, even though, I have chosen Christ, but you don't have to choose Christ and it's still okay? Or is it because he didn't really care that much about Christianity and he was just kind of using it as a tool? We can't know for sure. But whether Constantine actually converted and became a Christian emperor or not doesn't really matter, because Constantine becoming the emperor and then later actually defeating his co-emperor and becoming the full emperor of the entire empire, and just eliminating this whole tetrarchy concept, helped to make Christianity legitimate in the empire and made it a lot easier for it to spread. Constantine kind of became the patron of the Christian faith, which is a whole new concept for Christianity. For a long time, it was either directly opposed to power, to empire, or at least, philosophically opposed to empire. We've got Jesus, this guy who was murdered by the empire. And now all of a sudden we've got the emperor himself, maybe or maybe not, wholeheartedly espousing Christianity. So this is a huge reversal for Christianity. The persecutions of Diocletian are gone, and now the empire is not just tolerating Christianity, it's actually actively supporting it. He funded several basilicas that were built. He gave a lot of extra privileges to Christians, including exemption from from certain taxes for clerics, for clergy people. He promoted Christians to particularly high-ranking offices. He gave back a lot of the property that had been confiscated during the persecutions, that kind of thing. And then in 324, he began to build a new city. At that time, they called it New Rome, but eventually it became known as Constantinople after Constantine. And unlike the old Rome that had been built using the images and the values of the Roman gods, the New Rome was built using overtly Christian architecture, overtly Christian concepts of the idea. So, there were churches built within the city itself. There were not any temples that pre-existed from other religions, and so this was kind of the epitome of the Christian city, and it was built by Constantine, and then later was named Constantinople. So, pause. Questions?
We
Comments?
have about 15 minutes
Yes.
to get to the creed.
We're good. That's where we're going next. That's where we're going next. Okay. So we've talked about how religion can be used to bring the people together, to create stability so that power can keep its power, right? People in charge want to stay in charge. And so they use all the tools in their toolbox to make that happen. When they don't have ethnic connections, when they don't have economic connections, when they don't have a lot of other connections, religion is one thing that can be used, particularly when that religion applies to everyone, like Christianity does. So Constantine fully supports Christianity. He's building all these things for the Christians. He's adopted Christianity as his political foundation, if not his religious and personal faith foundation. And so now he wants to make sure that this foundation upon which he has built his power maintains its stability. But shortly after he fully gets in charge of the entire empire and becomes the sole emperor, he learns that maybe it's not going to be quite as easy as he thought. So we're going to kind of backtrack a little bit back to that original question that Bob was asking us. Who do you say that I am? We're still asking this question. Christians at this time are still asking this question, and they're still disagreeing about it. And so we're going to talk about a disagreement that was happening in Alexandria at the time that Constantine was consolidating his power. And this disagreement was between the bishop Alexander and the presbyter Arius. So I put up here a little quotation from Arius. That's a little challenging to follow, but I'm going to read it as it was translated. He did not write in English, by the way. If the Father begat the Son, he that was begotten had a beginning of existence. Hence it is that there was when the Son was not. It follows then of necessity that he had his existence from the non-existence. So what this is saying in flowery language is the Son is created. The Son is not eternal. The Son is different in substance, different in essence, different in its core stuffness than God. Jesus is not God. Arius. So, what is the problem with this? It's a very esoteric issue. Maybe not, doesn't seem very important, but why is Alexander so worried about this guy and his ideas? Why is this idea that the Son is created, the Son is not the same thing as God? Why does that matter?
Possibly because he considers himself a god.
Alexander considers himself a god. Okay.
Well, it's at the core of what Christianity is.
Yeah.
It challenges the very essence of that core.
So Alexander said, if Jesus is not God, then how do we know that his sacrifice was effective for all of us? If Jesus was not God, then God did not live among us. If Jesus is not God, then all of it falls apart, right? If Jesus is not God, then we are heretics. We're not worshiping God, we're worshiping this guy. And Alexander says this statement, this claim contradicts much evidence that we have in our scriptures. The Father and I are one, Jesus said. In the beginning was the Word, in the beginning. Well, if the Word, if Christ was created, then Christ was not there in the beginning, right? Because Christ had to be created after the beginning. And so Alexander is super angry about this. And he wants to squash Arius. Unfortunately, Arius and his ideas are very popular, and they start to spread very quickly. And so Constantine in 324 becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He defeats his co-emperor. And so now, because he had been, remember, his father was in the West. So he had been in the West. Now he's taken over the West and the East. And he now is learning, now that he's in charge of both sides, that there's this controversy between Alexander and Arius. So I'm sure he says to himself, I finally found the perfect solution to my problems. I'm going to use this Christianity thing. It's going to be great. I'm not going to let it, be the thorn in my side that Diocletian let it be. I'm going to use it instead of pushing it away and trying to defeat it. I'm going to absorb it, and I'm going to use it to establish stability in my empire. And now these two guys won't stop fighting about this dumb thing. And so he writes a letter to Alexander and Arius, and he told them that they needed to end their dispute and reconcile. And this was not the first time that Constantine had gotten involved in controversies within the church. He had tried to resolve a problem in North Africa that had happened. And he had specifically said in his instructions to these people, he kind of gave up the game here. He says, I do not wish you to leave schism or division of any kind anywhere. Why? He doesn't say, but we can fill in the blanks, because I need you guys to all agree, right? I need there to be stability. I need there to be a homogeneous understanding here. And so Constantine says, well, if you can't get along, then we are going to answer this question once and for all by calling a council. This was the first time that the entire church council had been, a council of the entire church had been called. They'd had regional councils where regional groups of bishops and leaders in the church had gotten together to make decisions and come to an agreement. But this was the first time that the entire church was asked to come. It also happened that right after the time that this council was scheduled, in approximately June of 325, on July 25th, the emperor was having a commemoration of his 20th year as emperor. And so just so happens that, we're going to have a party pretty soon after. And so they had they gathered together bishops representing the entire church. Of course, most of the people that were present were from that eastern side of things, because that's where they were. Let me show you where Nicaea is. So here's Nicomedia, that imperial palace place. And then right next to it here is Nicaea. So naturally, most of the bishops who came would have been from the eastern side of things, but there were some representatives from the west, so that they all got together. And the idea was, as Bob said in his sermon, that when we leave here, we're going to have a statement that everybody can agree to, everybody can sign their name to. But our good buddy Arius, he wanted to hold to his beliefs. And so he refused to sign on, and he was excommunicated.
You can see in that picture, he's there
Yes.
at the bottom.
So here's our buddy. Here's our buddy
he's that
Arius.
sad-looking guy at the bottom.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So our buddy Arius is cast into the pit, and everybody else has their halos, including Constantine, because they have bought into orthodoxy. They have bought into the correct understanding of Christianity.
And if you looked at that and said, "Oh, I thought that was Jesus in the middle," well,
Nope.
the artist wouldn't mind if you had made that mistake of confusing them,
Yes.
because that suited Constantine.
Constantine and Jesus can be conflated as much as we want. Yes. All right. So the Nicene Creed. I know this is kind of small, but I wanted to put the whole thing up here because the Nicene Creed, as we know it today, is actually not the same thing that came out of the not completely of the Council of Nicaea. What we say today is actually the Niceo-Constantinopolitan Creed, because they later, about 50 years later, they took this and they had another council in Constantinople where they added more to it. And so here we're missing a lot of the stuff about the life of Jesus. We're missing a lot of the stuff about the Holy Spirit. So I want to read this to you because it's going to sound very familiar, but there's going to be a lot missing. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of all things seen and unseen, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, the only begotten, that is, of the essence of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father, through him all things were made, who for us and for our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate and was made man. He suffered, and the third day he rose again. He ascended into heaven. From thence he shall come to judge the living and the dead. And in the Holy Spirit. That's it. And then there's also a little appendix. But those who say there was a time when he was not, and he was not before he was made, and he was made out of nothing, or he is of another substance or essence, or the Son of God is created, or changeable, or alterable, they are condemned by the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That's part of the creed.
Wow. That was the original one?
That was the original one, yes.
I'm glad it's
So it's interesting. So we've got this whole section down here. I know you can't see the words, but you can probably see the underlining. So this whole section down here is that what we call the anathemas, the condemnations of people who don't agree with us. So if we get rid of that, it's a pretty short paragraph actually, and the majority of the words are the upper part that I underlined here are all about this controversy that we're having with Arius. We have to emphasize begotten of the Father, the only begotten, that is of the same essence as the Father. He is God, he is light, he is true God, he was begotten. Third time we're saying that word, not made, of one being with the Father. So again, harping on this same thing over and over and over and over and over again, because the whole reason we got together was to talk about this issue, and Arius never agreed. And so we've got to tamp down on him. We've got to control this. We've got to get everybody on the same page. So they put this out. Now, what happens after this? Constantine is now known from here on out as the Christian emperor. We've already kind of talked about, is that true or not? Constantine was never baptized until he was on his deathbed. Constantine continued to what's the word I'm looking for? Ask for advice from Roman oracles throughout his life. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of evidence that Constantine really didn't care about this Christianity thing, except insofar as he could use it for his political motivations. But he's the Christian emperor. But Christianity is now in service to the empire. It's used for stability control and the homogenization of the values of the empire. There is now shared power between the church and the state. And I put that in quotations because the power still really remains with the emperor, but certain benefits are given to powerful people in the church. And now we've got one God, one Lord, one faith, one empire, all wrapped up together in one concept. So, ironically, the Council of Nicaea actually caused more divisions within the church. And so that's why they had to call another council 50 years later to deal with other things that were coming up. And that's why we ended up with more words, especially under the Jesus section of the Son section of our creed. And we'll talk more about that next time when we get into the present of our creed. But the precedents that were established by Constantine and by this circumstance, I don't think can be too strongly emphasized and too strongly understood as a major turning point for Christianity that might on the surface have looked good. Yay, no more persecutions. Yay, we are connected to power. But it completely turned the Jesus movement on its head and took it from that undermining of power and that role reversal, that the powerless and the weak are our focus, and just turned it right back into supporting the same structure, the same status quo that we've always had. And so for 1700 years since, that's kind of what we've been dealing with. And I think that it's important for us to continue to study things like this so that we can understand how our faith can easily be manipulated so that we can try to fight against that, because we're kind of stuck in the culture that we have, and it's hard for us to pick apart, the things in our culture that are Christian versus the things in our culture that are just an abuse of Christianity. But I think it's an important job that we have to continue to do after 1700 years. So, questions, comments, final thoughts?
For a future meeting, I would enjoy hearing if there's any writings that are out there supporting the Holy Spirit's involvement in this process, if any. Okay. Is God there guiding this process as just another step? Or was it power, a man in power that was dictating this for whatever reason?
So this is kind of giving away a little bit of the ball game, I think. Sorry. But what we're going to do in the worship services is we are going to talk about how the creed speaks to us and tells us about God. And in here, we're going to talk about how the creed is man-made and stuck in history and stuck in culture. And I think it's both. I think it's not an either or. I think it's a both. I think it's a matter of understanding that the writings and the history and the cultural absorption are real in terms of the sinfulness and the brokenness of the world, but that God can still work in and through those poor or even bad faith efforts to do something positive. That's why we are still studying this. And that's I think something that we'll get to more next time as well, when we talk about the present of the creed. Why are we still working on this if we believe that it was just a guy, trying to use it for his power? Well, because God can still work through a guy trying to manipulate Christianity for power. So yes, and stay tuned. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you for coming today. Thanks everybody online for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we will be back next month on the
Second Sunday of the month.
Is it the 13th? July 13th?
It is July 13th.
Okay, July 13th. We'll talk about perception.
All right. Thank you.
This